Hi, I'm Jean Ann Wright, and I'm a professional quilter, and one of the quilts I like to make the most is log cabin quilts. So last year I introduced my log cabin trim tool that makes 8-inch blocks, and it was so popular that this year we've come out with another tool that makes both 6-inch blocks and 12-inch blocks. So once I had a tool that made 2 blocks, I decided what fun it would be to make and design and make quilts that had both 6 and 12-inch blocks in it. The quilt behind me is a barn raising quilt, and it uses both the 6 and 12-inch blocks in one quilt, which adds a new type of creativity to making your log cabin quilts. Now, one of the really nice features of this tool is the only thing that you have to precision cut is your center square. And for the 6-inch blocks, you're going to precision cut a 2-inch center square, which will finish at 1.5 inches, and the logs will finish at 3/4 inch. And for the 12-inch square, you're going to precision cut a 3.5-inch center square, which finishes to 3 inches. Now I'm going to show you about cutting your strips or your logs. The wonderful thing about the trim tool is you can use any scrap for the logs as long as it is rotary cut on just one side. I can use this even though the other side you can see is quite a ragged cut. I also like to use leftover binding pieces, which I press out and use because they're going to be trimmed down. They don't have to be trimmed before you sew. And once again, I have pieces that are ripped and all kinds of pieces, so it cuts way down on your cutting. You're going to save lots of time in cutting. So I'm going to demonstrate now how to trim these blocks, and I'll start with the 6.5-inch block. I have my little 2-inch center square that I precision cut, and then I just use scraps to go around the outside edge, and they're in any number of widths. So once I've sewn 4 strips around the center square, I get ready to trim. And I center the centering square, just like the 8-inch rulers. This ruler has centering squares. These 3 for the 6-inch block, and then 3 big ones for the 12. So I'm going to center this square, take my rotary cutter, and just trim up and across. And then I'm going to give this square a half turn, take my trim tool, and once again I'm going to trim up and across. That's my first trim. And now I have a perfect center section of my block with its center square and the first row of logs sewn around. Now, one thing I do before I start trimming, I finger press when I'm sewing the strips or logs in place, and then before I trim, I like to iron my square so it makes a nice even trim. So here is my quilt with the next set of logs sewn around, or round 2. Once again, I'm going to trim up and across, turn my block a half turn, center that center square of my block on the centering square that is marked on my ruler, and trim up and across. Now I have my log cabin block with 2 rounds sewed around it, and this is now a perfect square and ready to add the next set of strips. Here I've sewed on my last set of strips to complete my block, and now I'm going to use, once again, I'm going to move one more step to use the centering square on the ruler. I'm going to trim up and across, and you can see I have all widths of fabric strips sewn onto this block, and then I'm going to trim up and across again, and then I will have a finished 6-inch square. I missed one little spot here. Trim it up. So there you have your finished 6-inch block. Now, to make the 12-inch block, I'm going to do the same thing. I've precision cut my 3.5-inch center squares. I've sewed 1 round of strips around it, the strips being cut just over 2 inches. I center the other side of my ruler with the centering square on the ruler on the center square of the block, and I trim up and across. I give the block a half turn, and once again I'm trimming up and across. So now I have the center of my 12-inch block done with one round. So now I've sewed 2 rounds onto this one. I've pressed it with the iron. I'm ready to trim the next set of strips. So I'm using the next centering square in progression on the tool, and I'm trimming up and across, giving the block a half turn. You notice I'm not turning the ruler, just the block. And once again, trimming up and across. And I've finished the second round on my log cabin block. Now, one more time, I'm going to trim the log cabin block. This time I've sewed all 3 rounds on my block, and I'm ready to finish it up. So I center the 3-inch centering square on that center square. I'm trimming up and across, and this time you'll notice I'm going all the way to the outer edges of the ruler, because it's a 12-inch square ruler. I turn the block a half turn again, and I trim up and across. It only takes a minute to center that centering square to get a good square block. And the nice thing about this is, if you do, I know you all sew perfect 1/4-inch seams, but if you do get a little off, every time you trim the block, you're trimming it to perfection, so you get a perfect block when you're finished. So when you've made enough of these blocks, you're ready to make your quilt. Now, I've done some quilts with this because it makes more than just the log cabin block. For instance, using just the 6-inch squares, I made this little doll quilt for my granddaughter. It's not quilted yet, but she's getting this for Christmas with her new doll. And I only used the 6-inch side of the ruler for it. But then I also did, for the cut loose patterns, this quilt called Wings, and it uses a combination of 6 and 12-inch blocks to make the quilt design. And it's another variation of the barn raising. So you can see how versatile this ruler is, how many blocks, how many projects you can make using this ruler.